Hey, Father.
Yeah, Steve. How are you guys?
Where should we log on to?
You're good. I can see you. You need to. You should scroll down your list, and it's up as Peter is the Archbishop, and just click on his screen.
I don't have a list of screens.
Oh, go up to at the top, and it will say Gallery View, and you can pick. Let me get my mic on. You can pick several
participants.
Yep.
Is it participants or more?
Oh, you know what? I'll have to work on this. I need to get to the Archbishop. I'm actually listed as the host right now. When you look down the list of participants, you should be able to pick him.
What would it be under? I got me.
Oh yeah. Hey, if down at the bottom, manage participants. Let me see if I can unhost me. I don't think I can. I have to work with that next week.
Okay.
Because yeah. So see if you can't pick on Peter. Here we go. Here we go. Make host. You want to change yes. So all right. So now the Archbishop is the host. You should be able to find him in your drawdown list and click on him.
I'll click on him. Okay.
Thanks. He's got great video clarity. I can read the names of his books on his back shelf.
I'm in a chat thing. Let me go back. Maybe I need to
Unfortunately, that also means you can see all the junk I've carefully thrown up there.
There it is.
There we go.
All right, I'm sure I'm going to jump in for just 1 second. At 6:30, I'm sure the few people will jump in here in a minute because there's always people late. But thank you all for last week. The Archbishop. Now I'm sure you're going to find I'm just a student. Now we get the master to be talking to us on this. This is his specialty. But remember, and I'll remind you at the end of class, I do need you to email me that you attended the class so that I have a record of everybody that attended, because I have to keep a chart for our Theological Institute as who was in attendance. So, Archbishop, glad to have you back from vacation. We're all eager to hear you go.
Right. I suppose to a certain extent I need to backpedal a little bit and talk about Anglo-Saxon England. One of the things that you have to be very clear about in the early medieval period is that England and the English, as we understand them today, did not exist. When the tribes that came to be the English came from Germany and the lower part of what is now Denmark in the 5th and 6th centuries, they tended to settle in discrete areas. So the extreme southeast of the country was mainly settled by Jutes. The rest of the southern part of that part of Britain we now call England was settled by Saxons. East Anglia, the Midlands, and the North were settled by the Angles. In fact, the Anglian migration from what is now the area around Flensburg in northern Germany was so complete, it was almost a case of would the last man out blow out the candles. And as a result of this, you have a very complete replacement of the culture in southern and eastern Britain. So when you're looking at the archaeological remains, for example, in my hometown, the oldest sites from the 790s, the 500s, are already completely Anglian. Christianity retreated west with the Celts. And so for the next 100 years, there is very, very little Christian influence in southern and eastern Britain. It seems that there are isolated pockets of Celts who had been Christianized in places like Elmet, which is the area immediately to the east of Leeds, which was protected by the major rivers coming down into the Humber estuary. But for the most part, Christianity retreated westwards with the Celts. And the Celts were none too happy about their Anglo and Saxon neighbours. You'll remember the story of the White Dragon and the Red Dragon from the stories of King Arthur, how the Red Dragon is vanquished by the White Dragon, representing the Angles and the Saxons. And there was a very hostile attitude from the remaining Celts, the remaining Britons, towards the Anglo and Saxon invaders. On their part, they didn't see what they needed to have to do with the faith of the vanquished. And so you have to see southern and eastern Britain as reverting in large measure to paganism, and Christianity hanging on very successfully in the West, although Gildas has more than a few things to say about the quality of those who are bishops in his time. Now, if I can get it up in front of the camera so that you can see it, this map roughly shows the invasions to around 500 AD. So you can see Eastern Britain is pretty much entirely Anglo. The south is largely Saxon. There's pockets of Jute occupation around the Solent and in Kent. The west side of the country is still very much British. And what happens during the rest of the 6th century, the 500s, is that the Britons are slowly pushed further westwards. The reason for this is a series of poor harvests around 509 to 530 AD, which are reflected in the dendrochronological record. You get some very, very thin tree rings from the first part of the 6th century. And of course, with bad weather came famine, starvation, epidemic, and a decline in the population, which the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes took advantage of. So what happens to the church? Well, first of all, the idea that the Angles and the Saxons moved into southern and eastern Britain and completely replaced the existing population disappeared with the invention, or rather the discovery, of DNA. If you are British, as a very big generalization, you have a Celtic mother and an Anglo or Saxon father. It's mainly a matter of young men coming into Britain, acquiring land, marrying, settling down. There were some families came across, and there's a sort of gradient from east to west, with the east being the most Germanic, the west being the most Celtic, which reflects the pattern of migration some 1500 years ago. The Angles and the Saxons were pagan. They worshipped the old Germanic pantheon, headed by Woden, and of course these stories they shared in common with their Scandinavian neighbours, which will become germane a little bit later on. From the church's point of view, what was to be done about Britain? Well, Gregory the Great seems to be the one who came up with what I can only describe as the church's northern strategy. He saw Anglo-Saxon Britain, I'm a little wary of using that term, as the key to converting the Germanic peoples. So when he sends Augustine of Canterbury from the monastery of St. Andrew in Rome to Kent in 596 AD, it's not just simply with the conversion of the Jutes, Angles, and Saxons in mind. It is with a long-term plan to convert the Germanic tribes of Northern Europe. Of course, St. Augustine's way in had been secured by the marriage of Ethelbert to Bertha, a Frankish princess who was already Christian. And as such, she opened the door for Christian missionaries to go into Kent. It's purely that accident of history that made Canterbury the ecclesiastical capital of southern England. Because St. Gregory's original plan was for the southern archbishopric to be in London. But of course, the Jutish centre of power was in Canterbury, and that is where Augustine built his church. To this day, the remains of St. Augustine's monastery, which was originally the monastery of the Holy Trinity, survive a little bit to the east of what we now regard as Canterbury Cathedral. The other thing that Augustine would have seen when he got to Canterbury in 596 AD was the remains of St. Martin's Church, which shows by even its remaining structure signs of having been originally a Roman church built probably somewhere in the 4th century. From Canterbury, the Roman mission to the Angles and Saxons first of all went to London and then into Essex. Essex proved to be a very difficult place for the missionaries to get a hold. The dynastic politics there with father against son led to a reversion to paganism under Ragwold, which starts in about 617 AD and lasts well into the middle of the 7th century. If you've heard of the Sutton Hoo ship that was discovered in 1938, the great ship burial a little bit to the east of Ipswich, that is often proposed today to have been the burial place of Ragwold, the great pagan king who marks the culmination of pagan kingship in that part of England. It's only after his death that missionaries are able to return to Essex. The north was initially evangelized by St. Paulinus, who was sent in 627 in response to a request of St. Oswald to evangelize in the north. Oswald is killed at Oswestry in 631. There's a brief reversion to paganism, and then you have the great missionary work of St. Aidan beginning from the north, beginning around 631 and slowly pushing southwards. So the north and the Midlands, the mainly Anglic parts of what was to become England, are evangelized by Scottish missionaries coming south. Saxon England is largely evangelized by Roman missionaries coming out of Canterbury. The inevitable collision takes place in the 650s, when, although Mercia has not, that's the Midlands, has not yet been effectively evangelized, the King of Northumbria marries a Kentish princess, and they have wee problems like they celebrate Easter on different dates. And the desire to get some sort of uniformity of practice leads to the Synod of Whitby, which accepts the Roman date of Easter, the Roman form of tonsure, and also gives preference to the Roman form of government, though you have to be very careful about saying that the English Church came under Roman obedience in 664. Rome was an awfully long way away, and as a result of this, the English Church tended to measure itself against the Frankish church a little further to the south, and any instructions from Rome took an awful long time to get to Britain. Shortly after the Synod of Whitby, when the old Archbishop of Canterbury dies, it seems as though the whole process of evangelization is stalling. And for several years, the See of Canterbury remains empty. And it's only with the papal provision of Theodore of Tarsus as Archbishop in 669 that the process begins again. Theodore of Tarsus was already an old man in 669. He was born somewhere around 603, so he's in his mid-60s. That is old for the 7th century. When he got to Britain, there were only 3 bishops operational, one of whom was Wilfrid, second of which was Chad, and the Bishop of Winchester was still at work in the south. Otherwise, dioceses were vacant, the church had fallen into disorganization. Of the bishops who were active at the time, Chad is the one with which I'm most familiar because St. Chad historically was the founder of the parish I grew up in. He was trained in the typical Celtic manner. He was one of the 12 disciples of St. Cuthbert. Cuthbert himself had been one of the 12 disciples of St. Aidan, and he had been taught in that tradition. He had accepted the decisions of the Synod of Whitby and had been appointed as Bishop of York after Wilfrid skipped town and went to Germany to do some evangelization, having fallen out with the king. For me, Wilfrid is one of the least attractive figures in English church history. The man is always appealing to him. He's always falling out with the king, and apparently wasn't too popular with his own clergy because he was far from humble. He's really the first of the prince bishops. He rode around on a horse. He expected due deference to be paid to him. He lived in the style of a petty prince, and he was always coming into conflict with other bishops, other clergy, the king, the thanes. He was a nuisance. However, he was a very important nuisance because his administrative ability enabled him to administer first the Diocese of Ripon, then the Diocese of York, then the Diocese of Hexham. And in each church to which he was assigned, he left behind him an efficient school, which of course meant the next generation could be nurtured to spread the gospel, and also an efficient system of administration. Now, one of the things you have to be very aware of in this period is parish churches, as we know them today, did not exist. Lords would build chapels which were visited by priests who belonged to the bishop's household. Just how consistent this ministry was, we don't know. I mean, you don't have a vast amount of documentation for the Anglo-Saxon period. Certainly, certain towns and villages were particularly associated with these central churches. So in northern Lincolnshire, again, I'm going back to what I'm most familiar with, Lincoln had a minster church, Stowe, 12 miles away, had a minster, Curtin in Lindsey, another 12 miles on, had a minster. And you can imagine a group of priests living at these central churches and going out into the countryside to baptize, to celebrate the Eucharist, and to preach. And this was to remain the pattern for at least the next 200 years. You don't really get parish churches until the 9th century. Theodore of Tarsus's reform of the English church between 669 and 690 was so thorough that it carries the church through most of the following century. And it only really begins to fall apart with the incursion of the Norsemen into Britain beginning in 793 with the famous raid on Lindisfarne. But of course, it would be somewhat of a mistake to regard this as a golden age. There were already complaints early in Alcuin's stay in the 750s.
Hey, Archbishop.
Not to put too fine a point on
Hey, hey, somebody, could you please mute your connection? We're picking up a lot of background noise and it's hard to hear. Thank you. Sorry, Archbishop.
Think of this as a golden age because already at the beginning of Alcuin's career in the 760s, you can hear him complaining about monasteries which weren't really monasteries, but were schemes for avoiding military service. Another one of his complaints is the clergy are not very well educated. Mind you, compared to Alcuin, most people in the middle of the 8th century were as thick as two short planks in the education department. Also, by the 770s, you have what was to become the diocesan structure for the English Church for the next 1200 years in place. Originally, there was a bishop for each kingdom. So the Archbishop of Canterbury was the Bishop of Kent, the Bishop of London was the Bishop of Essex, the Bishop of Dunwich was the Bishop of East Anglia, the Bishop of Winchester was the Bishop of Wessex, the Archbishop of York was the Bishop of Durham, which was the southern part of Northumberland. The Bishop of Lindisfarne was the Bishop of Bernicia, which is the northern part of Northumberland. Mercia was ruled from Lichfield. The strange border territory of the Hwicai was ruled from Hereford. And these bishoprics that were coterminous with the kingdoms were gradually split up. So, for instance, Winchester is divided into Winchester and Sherborne. Lichfield is divided into Lichfield and Leicester. The funny little bishopric of Lindsey in northern Lincolnshire exists to take care of a sort of petty kingdom that thrived in the instability between Northumbria and Mercia. They even distinguished themselves by having a King Bubba. I'm not kidding. There really was a King Bubba. And as a result of this, that was kind of the grandfather, as it were, of the Diocese of Lincoln. This situation continues until the Viking raids, the Viking settlements of the 8th and 9th centuries. Now, Moorman rather reflects the 1930s view of the Vikings. And we have come an awful long way in the last 80 years in our understanding of the impact of the Vikings on Britain. First of all, the Vikings had a reason for striking into Western Europe. It comes back to our old friend politics. The Holy Roman Empire, as it was shortly to become, although in 793 it was still the Frankish kingdom, was looking to expand. And as a result of this, it's putting pressure on the Danevirk, which is the line of defences, if you can see this. There's a line of defences across the southern part of Denmark, and then of course you've got the Frankish kingdom here. You'll notice that what is marked as the Frankish kingdom here is mainly modern Germany. At that time it would have covered much of France as well. But the pressure is being applied there. And like all good warlords, if somebody is jerking your chain, you go and jerk theirs. So there's a policy of launching raids into Western Europe from what was to become Denmark and Norway to, first of all, filter wealth back to Scandinavia. Monasteries were, from a raiding party's point of view, a wonderful target. If you're in the average Viking raiding ship, which is about 60 feet long and has 20 oars a side, you have got about 40 men. That's enough to take on a monastery. So places like Lindisfarne, later on Iona, Derry, the coastal monasteries were easy targets. Even Clonmacnoise, deep in the heart of Ireland on a bend in the River Shannon, became a target because Vikings can row upstream. And they took all this wealth back to Scandinavia. There's also a suggestion that by the late 8th century, Scandinavia was facing overpopulation. There was a shortage of agricultural land. Couple that with the pressure from the Frankish kingdom and the consistent pattern of the Vikings of trading and raiding along the river systems of northern Europe, you can see why they have the impetus to move forwards. And this period of raiding lasts, in the case of Britain, about 60 years. And then we end up in the world of myth and legend. The version of the story that's recorded in the sagas, have any of you watched that somewhat unhistorical show, The Vikings, on the History Channel? Right, Ragnar Lothbrok is... The legend of Ragnar Lothbrok ends with him being executed by King Aylmer of Northumberland around 860. And it is, according to the sagas, the revenge of Ragnar's 4 sons that brings about the Viking invasion of England. Now, how much we take that as being historical fact, I don't know, but certainly the archaeological record would tend to bear out certain parts of it, like, you know, Ivar the Boneless rode up the River Trent to Repton, made a winter camp there during the campaign of 872, 873, and died there. When they were rummaging around in the vicarage garden in the 1690s, they found a large pagan burial site, complete with a skeleton of more than usual height. The chap apparently was somewhere around 6'3", which is exceptionally tall for the late 9th century, surrounded by the accoutrements of war. And it's tempting to put that as being Ragnar Lothbrok's grave. They also temporarily converted the church into part of the defences for their winter fort. This period in England from 850 through to about 950 has the Vikings ruling a major part of Britain. Basically anything north and east of Watling Street is largely under Danish or Norse occupation throughout this period, and also under Norse rule. And as a result of this, the cultural division that still exists between north and south in England is firmly established, because the north is heavily settled by Danes. Around where I grew up, about 3/4 of the place names have Danish terminations. And the south, where the Angles and the Saxons remained in charge. However, if you'd been looking at it in 871, 872, you could have been forgiven for thinking that these petty English kingdoms were well on their way to becoming Denmark West. The only kingdom that hadn't collapsed was Wessex. And Wessex, in the early 870s, was confined to a small area of the Somerset Levels, where, of course, we have the famous stories about King Alfred burning the cakes and surviving on eel stew until he's able to collect enough in terms of a resistance movement to start pushing back against the Danish invaders. The Danes could achieve many things, but the one thing they were not good at was building an empire, because there was no single strong dynasty, no single strong overlord. So if you look at the politics of Wessex in the 9th and the 10th century, you've got a clearly defined succession of kings. If you look at the politics of the Kingdom of York under Danish control in that same period, it's a case of who cut whose throat, who's the pretender, who's on the throne, when are they going to swap over, and whose wife is the power behind the throne. I mean, you could write a good soap opera just based on the politics of York in the early 10th century. The outstanding fact about Alfred, though, is that he was, by the measure of the early Middle Ages, a saint. He was a pious man. He loved learning. Unlike most kings of his period, he eventually acquired literacy. He was keen on church reform. He was keen on codifying the law. He worked out how to stop the Danes becoming a permanent presence in his kingdom by the erection of burhs, or boroughs as we would call them today, which were defended towns. And he gave a lot of attention to the promotion of Christianity, particularly amongst the Danes. So part of the agreement that was eventually reached between Alfred and Guthrum in 878 was that the Danish king should be baptized before he would be left in peace in East Anglia. And this royal conversion to Christianity, which took place at Edlington in Wiltshire, seems to have been the turning point in relations between Wessex and East Anglia. The East Anglian Danes converted to Christianity, the diocesan system goes on, they're gradually absorbed into Greater Wessex, which eventually becomes England. In the north, it's much more complicated. It's almost certain that significant numbers of Scandinavians settled in the north, kept their old religion. The stone crosses often have Christian scenes on one side, walk around the back, and you've maybe got Sigurd roasting the dragon's heart from the Nibelungen lead on the back. There's this mix of Christian and pagan symbols. The hogback tombs that you get in northern England from this period often have Christian symbolism on the south, east and west sides, but pagan symbolism on the north side. It's a very mixed period. Certain bishoprics sink, never to reappear. Lindsey disappears around 810, 812 AD. Leicester is moved southwards to Dorchester-on-Thames, out of the immediate Danish area. The archbishops of York are kept around by the Danish kings of York on a very short chain, it has to be said, because that was their way of controlling the Anglo-Saxon portion of the population. But many church institutions like monasticism, schools, go through an extremely bad period between around 850 and 950. The Vikings are still very much with us in terms of the north of England. Place names, dialect, the difference in attitude between north and south. There's still that sort of hangover from having been a separate kingdom to the south. And it was maintained all through the Middle Ages with the Council of York, this awareness that in some sense the north was a borderland. It was also an area that was very important from the point of view of creating that interface between the Vikings and Christianity. They ran into Christians in York, they ran into Christians in Nottingham or any of the other boroughs in the north. The Danes began converting to Christianity. Christianity began to be carried back to Scandinavia. And although it's not as well recorded as the great project of converting Frisia and Germany in the 8th century, St. Willibrord, St. Boniface and their work, nonetheless, this connection between England and Scandinavia promotes the conversion of the Vikings, the Scandinavian kingdoms, to Christianity. And this is completed around 1060 AD. The names are often quite instructive. For instance, the first bishop of Stavanger was an Englishman called Sigurd. The name is Scandinavian, the guy was an Englishman. There's this sort of overlap between Scandinavian and English usages. And there's a real sense in which England is not part of the Western European world, unless you're down in Wessex, but more part of the Northern European Viking world. The great trade routes that ran through York ran from Iceland and Greenland, Dublin, through York to Scandinavia and the Russian river system. And you can see it even in the way in which goods move. You get little Byzantine coins with the emperor's image of them being imported into York through Russia. You also, by the way, get Arab coins, dinars from Damascus, being found in the Viking parts of York, levels at York, because of this vast trade route. But Christianity also followed these trade routes. It was probably a major step forward in the conversion of the Scandinavian peoples to Christianity when Russia became Christian in 988. The Rus were a Swedish tribe who were running the local Slavs because they didn't run themselves very well. And as a result of this, it increased the pressure on the Scandinavian homeland to convert to Christianity. But what of the church in England? The 10th century sees a renaissance, and the chief name in that renaissance is Dunstan. Of course, he's best remembered these days for having tweaked the devil's nose with a pair of blacksmith's tongs, a good piece of medieval sermon fodder, if ever there was one. But he was a scholar, a bishop, and a diplomat. He's associated principally with Glastonbury, a minor monastery until his time there, Winchester, and finally with Canterbury. He promoted education. He promoted the reinvigoration of monasticism, so that by the end of the 10th century, you have some major groups of monasteries. For example, you have the East Anglian group, Ely, Peterborough, and Crowland, and Thorney. Thorney migrated to Crowland at one stage, which were very influential. My hometown was an estate of the monastery at Peterborough. And so our Anglo-Saxon church, just let me see if I can find a photograph of it, our Anglo-Saxon church fits in to a set of tower churches, turriform churches, that are associated with the area around Peterborough. Let's see if you can see this photograph. If you see there, you've got 2/3 of the Anglo-Saxon church. The small annex on the left-hand side of the page is the original baptistry, and then most of the tower, the very top stage is early Anglo-Norman, about 1070, was the nave of the church, and then there was an extension on the other side, about the same side of the baptistry, which was the original chancel. And that sort of church is very characteristic of the work undertaken by Peterborough Abbey around 1000 AD. 1000 AD also was a psychological liberation. folks had been expecting the world to end in 1000 AD. There are two series of surviving Anglo-Saxon sermons which are very concerned with this idea that the Last Judgment was going to come in 1000 AD and telling everybody to get ready. But 1000 AD came, 1000 AD went, and not a lot happened, except for another Danish invasion. One of the less well-known events in English history is something known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre, which took place on the 6th of November 1006. And one of the unfortunate mistakes that the Anglo-Saxons made, of course this is the reign of Ethelred the Unready, Ethelred the Ill-Advised, was that one of the victims of the St. Brice's Day Massacre happened to be the sister of Sven Forkbeard, the King of Denmark. Well, Sven was not one of those who calmed down quickly. And some 6 years later, he launches a massive invasion of northern Britain, his main access point being the River Humber, and he defeats the English army under Ethelred the Unready. Unfortunately, he doesn't live to enjoy his success. He dies at Gainsborough in 1013, and briefly England reverts to English control, but his son, Canute the Great, comes over in 1016 and takes control. Now, Canute is a little bit of an unexpected figure. His family are not exactly noted for being the world's most enthusiastic Christians. But Canute is. He wants to govern England. He talks to the bishops. He listens to the bishops. He gives money and estates to the church. He at least comes within a measurable distance of being at least an outwardly pious man. He rules according to law. And so the 20 years of his reign from 1016 to 1035 represent a final flowering of the Anglo-Saxon church. He appoints a series of very capable bishops. He tends to stay out of church affairs. He encourages monasticism. And by doing this, he is regarded as a patron of learning, a patron of the church, someone who will lead England in its traditional, by this point, Christian and sort of Anglo-Saxon identity. Unfortunately, his two sons were totally worthless as kings. There's a final reversion to Edward the Confessor, who was an Aethelling. Edward the Confessor had lived for 20 years in Normandy, and he was more Norman than Anglo-Saxon. He hated England. It was cold, it was wet, he had to drink beer, he had none of the silks and finery that he was used to in Normandy, and he had to deal with all these, the great English earls, chief of whom were the Godwinson clan. And of course, when Edward dies in 1066, shortly after the consecration of Westminster Abbey, he is replaced by Harold Godwinson. Harold Godwinson was one of those guys who you didn't want to stand next to in a thunderstorm. He seems to have had a consistent run of bad luck. He had a brother, Tostig, who was nothing but trouble. Another brother was only a fair weather friend. So that when he was faced with two significant challenges to his leadership in September and October 1066, he was really put on his mettle. Harold is often remembered as the king who lost England. And as an administrator of the church, he had his limitations. But as a king, he certainly tried to do the right thing. He musters an army, he marches north, he meets the invading force led by Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge and succeeds in overwhelming a careless Norwegian army. Of the 7 kings who came with Harold Hardrada to England to invade it. The only one who seems to have escaped was Godred Crovan, the King of Man. The rest died on the battlefield. Having defeated Hardrada, he received the news that William the Bastard of Normandy had landed on the south coast. So he has to hot-foot it the 240 miles from York to the south coast to meet the challenge of William. William, of course, is a Norman. Normans are basically Vikings who have learned to ride horses. And this form of mounted warfare brings about the end of Anglo-Saxon England, because finally Harold's army loses its discipline, sees the Normans retreating back down Senlac Hill for the third or fourth time, and goes after them. At that point, the Normans turn around and cut Harold's army to pieces. He's left making a final stand with his housecarls. The word, interestingly, is a Danish one, housecarl. Makes a stand with his housecarls on the top of Senlac Hill and dies in battle. That is the end of Anglo-Saxon England to all intents and purposes. William had one important advantage. He had the Pope's blessing to invade England. From the Pope's point of view, the English Church was very corrupt. The Archbishop of Canterbury, for example, was a rich pluralist. Stigand was not just Archbishop of Canterbury, he was also Bishop of Winchester. He was married. He had no scruple about enriching his children by the use of church property. On the other end of the spectrum was Wulfstan of Worcester, who was regarded as almost a living saint. He's the only one of the Anglo-Saxon bishops who gains William the Conqueror's confidence. And so when William takes over in England, there's a very rapid translation from Anglo-Danish or Anglo-Saxon rule to an aristocracy that is made up largely of William's hangers-on. He appoints Thomas of Bayeux as Archbishop of York in 1068. Thomas is not particularly popular in the northern England, and when the Yorkshire goes up in flames in 1069, attempting a rebellion and the imposition of a Danish king in northern England, Thomas of Bayeux has to retreat rather swiftly to the south of England. And that, of course, leads to William the Conqueror's harrying of the north, which will be important in the next episode when we begin to discuss the Cistercian order in England. Also, William has some common sense ideas for reforming the church. He may have disposed of most of the Anglo-Saxon bishops, but the men that he brought in from Normandy and from northern France were generally extremely competent. Lanfranc, for example, was an Italian, basically an Italian Norman, because the Normans wandered all over the place in the 10th century and the early 11th century. He had been abbot of Bec in Normandy for some years. He was a very learned man, a very pious man, and also he was absolutely in lockstep with William when it came to church affairs. He wanted to reform the liturgy, he wanted to reform the diocesan system, he wanted to reform the clergy schools. However, he acknowledged William's supremacy as king. The Pope might be shouting very loudly about how he was head of the church, but so far as Lanfranc was concerned, William was the head of the church in England. He made the decisions. Lanfranc made sure that William chose the right candidates. And it's an era when a lot of reforms take place. Certain dioceses are moved. For instance, Selsey is moved to Chichester, which was the largest town in the area. Dorchester, which is an obscure little village on the Thames, is replaced as the diocesan centre by Lincoln, which is one of the 5 great northern boroughs. In the reign of Edward the Confessor, the Diocese of Crediton had been moved to the major port of Exeter. Dunwich, which was a tiny little village, although it was something of a port, the cathedral there is replaced initially by North Elmham, which is another royal estate, then by Thetford, and finally by Norwich. William is very careful to put the bishops in the major towns and to align them with the major Norman aristocracy. So you've got a working alliance between church and state to push through reform. Lanfranc also brings ideas like celibacy of the clergy from the continent. But Lanfranc is not stupid. His decision on celibacy of the clergy is that he will not ordain married men in future, but the parish clergy are allowed to retain their wives. The parish system, by the way, is just beginning to become a national phenomenon in the early 11th century. The south of England had already been mapped out into parishes. The north was getting there. It's not really completed until the end of the 12th century. And Lanfranc's insistence on celibacy of the clergy without upsetting incumbents gradually allows this typically Roman institution to become ingrained in England, although it takes a lot longer in the north than it does in the south. The monarchy has less control in the north. Lanfranc was a scholar, and he promoted the great monastic schools. There's some suggestion that Oxford may have got its first start as a monastic school during Lanfranc's tenure, but it's Oxford men who say that, so take it with a grain of salt. Similarly, the great monastic school at York, which still exists as St. Peter's School, it is revived and reformed during William the Conqueror's reign. The problem really is that when William dies, his reforming measures come to an absolute dead stand because William Rufus is only interested in the church for one reason: to finance his lifestyle. So when Lanfranc dies in 1089, the Archbishopric of Canterbury is kept vacant for 4 years. William Rufus only appoints Anselm as Archbishop of Canterbury when he was on his deathbed, as he thought, and briefly gets religion. And he continues this pattern of keeping dioceses vacant so the king can receive the revenues. He basically regards the church as a cash cow to support his rather lavish lifestyle. It's no surprise, therefore, that William Rufus accidentally...
Hey, Archbishop?
Yes?
Hey, Archbishop? Yep. Hey, not to be the mediator, but...
Last paragraph.
Yeah, last paragraph. We got 10 minutes, and I want to make sure that, man, you've covered so much stuff. I'm sure a lot of folks have questions.
Okay. Just remind me I'm at William Rufus next week. Okay.
I think you're already into the third chapter anyway, or the third segment. I think you already crossed that timeline.
1109.
Yeah. So, hey, look, this was phenomenal. I got 1,000 questions, but I'm not going to go ahead. Hey, you guys, who's got some questions for the Archbishop? Well, nobody's unmuting, so I'll ask you the first question. And
Okay.
hey, yeah, I have a couple questions. I want to jump back a little bit, and let's dive in. Well, I have a two-part question. One is that we have this kind of division of the Irish Celtic Church, and we've gone up the West Coast. We've gone up through Ireland. We've gone up through the West Coast. My readings have never been very much heavily on the English side. Mine's always been on the Celtic side. And we talk about monasticism. You were just talking about the revival of monasticism. We talked about the line of the West and the East and the East Coast there, you know, the Anglo-Saxons, even later Roman. We've read some interpretations of the Celtic interpretations, but as this, with the dying out of the Celtic Church, which still took a couple hundred years, but where did this revival of the English Church? Is it a Roman influence? Is it a Celtic influence? Or was it kind of like this in-house English influence that was outside of Roman Celticism?
It's a little bit of a mix, in the sense that the old Celtic-inspired monasticism of the Anglo-Saxons dies with the Viking raids of around 800 AD. And although they followed the Benedictine rule in part, they also had that more sort of solitary, eremitic, Celtic tradition going on. If you look at where most of the great Anglo-Saxon monasteries were, they were on islands or something pretty close to an island. And then there are a cluster of huts around a church. You know, there's a definite, easily seen Celtic influence there. But the influence that you get from Dunstan is towards the Benedictine order. But it's a Benedictine order that's adapted to the English church. It's not a straightforward crib of the Cluniac reform of the 10th century. Did that get it?
Yeah. I was just wondering, but inside of this movement in the Anglo-Saxon Viking area, who was the major influence? Was it truly an English influence that revitalized or evangelized the Anglos, the Saxons, these different groups? Or was it Romans that came in that really took the lead in this? How did that revival happen?
The re-evangelization of the North is largely homegrown. I mean, Northern England was probably never less than 70% Christian. So you're converting the pagan Danish minority to Christianity. They could be pretty tough nuts to crack, but nonetheless, they were a minority. They assimilated into the majority culture. However, they'd already done their damage in terms of the destruction of monasteries and the dislocation of the diocesan system. And I think it's from Northern England that Christianity slowly works its way back to Scandinavia as something that sticks, as opposed to occasional missions up from Bremen and Hamburg, which tended to happen, tended to end on the end of a sword.
All right. Hey, anybody else? Say, people got some questions out there? I don't want to dominate the floor.
I have a question.
Hello, Paul.
Hello, Bishop. This was interesting to me, and not knowing a real lot about England, when you said that even to this day, there's somewhat of a cultural difference between Southern England and Northern England, Northern England being a little more Danish influenced and such. And you even said some reference to dialect of speech. Could you explain a little bit more today, kind of what that difference in culture is?
Well, people from the north of England are notoriously reserved. They've got that sort of Scandinavian distance to them. And it's something that seems to have held up over the centuries. Also, northern dialect words are often of Old Norse origin. So, for example, the dialect word for a flea in the north of England is a lop, which is the same word as it would be in Norwegian. We have, for instance, if you're laying down, you're ligging. And I had to laugh the other day, a few weeks ago. I saw a photograph of a sleeping car on the Swedish railway system, and it had Liggerwagen written down the side. It's the same word used in English dialect as is used in modern Swedish. We refer to children as barns, which is the Old Norse word. It hangs on in the language, although, of course, the base of the language is English, but the dialect words often have Old Norse origins, and of course, Old Norse has had its influence on English grammar. Our sentence structure is probably a little closer to Old Norse than most other Germanic languages.
Would Lancashire be in the north?
Lancashire is, yes. Lancashire has a little bit more Norwegian than Danish influence. And also there's a lot more residual Celtic influence there because, basically the Anglo-Saxons, the Angles didn't really get over the Pennine Range very much. You have an enclave in the Wirral, which is northern Cheshire and into southern Lancashire, which was colonized by the Norwegians in the 10th century. But the place names there, although the Saxons got up there, the Angles and the Saxons got in there, it's a more Celtic, the Celtic side of the brew is more dominant. There's one place in Lancashire called Eccles. The name derives from ecclesia. It's thought it's the site of an ancient British church.
Thank you.
All right. Anybody else have another question?
I have a couple of questions.
Yeah, shoot away.
Archbishop, what's going on in Scotland at this time?
Now then, Scotland is part of the Celtic Church. You have a series of monastic bishoprics, for instance, Dunblane, Dunkeld. Iona is intermittently important during this period. Whithorn, down in Galloway, is another monastic cathedral. It's very much the same setup as the Irish Church. The abbots are dominant. They have a bishop on the staff, as it were. The liturgy is still the Irish variant of the Gallican liturgy. Part of the reform that takes part in Scotland around 1100 is the introduction of standard Western European ways of doing things into what was still largely a Celtic church.
And is there like an intermingling with Northern England and this Scottish?
The most southwest eastern of Scottish seas, which at that time was St Andrews, lay rather uncomfortably between the English way of doing things and the Celtic way of doing things, in that it was staffed by, the Bishop of St Andrews was the dominant influence. However, the cathedral was run by the Culdees, who were a religious order that's uniquely Scottish. It consists of a college of priests. They lived under a rule, but we really don't know that much about them. St Andrews was eventually converted into a college of Augustinian canons, but that's only with the reforms that come with St Margaret of Scotland at the very end of the 11th century.
Can you put a picture of a church? Are there other relics still in existence today?
There are about 200 churches which are partly Anglo-Saxon.
Okay.
Just in the northern part of Lincolnshire, there is Stowe, Broughton, Barton upon Humber, Scatha, all have significant, St Peter in Lincoln, they all have obvious and quite significant Anglo-Saxon remains. Ripon Cathedral has an early Anglo-Saxon crypt, as does Hexham. There's another at Lastingham, which of course is a site particularly associated with St. Ced, who converted Essex in the 670s. So, you know, it's still there physically. But what you get is a little bit of a building. You don't get whole buildings. The only complete Anglo-Saxon churches I can think of are Brixworth in Northamptonshire, which has actually been reduced in size by the demolition of its side chapels, and Bradford-on-Avon in Somerset, where they found found a complete 8th century church converted into a cottage in the 19th century and converted it back into a church. But there's still quite a bit of Anglo-Saxon stuff kicking around if you know what you're looking for.
Okay. It didn't all get destroyed over time.
Oh, no. In most cases, it's a case of, well, this is a perfectly good tower. We're not going to run to the expense of building a new one. But that tiny little Anglo-Saxon church has got to be replaced. So you'll get a Saxon tower with a medieval church grafted onto it.
All right. Anybody else have a question for him? All right. Well, hey, we are at 7:34. What a great session. I recorded this. So anybody that would like a copy of it, we will have it available to email you. I know I got a couple people that couldn't dial in tonight. They're waiting for this. Remind everybody, please email me that you were dialed in so I can record that you were present for this class. Archbishop, thank you again very much for this, and we look forward to next week.
And next week will be Anselm through to, I think, around 1300. So you've got a couple more chapters of Moorman to read.
All right. Well, God bless everybody. Thank you for tuning into the Institute's great learning session. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.